All right, so we didn't initially know that I was going to be in town, and they graciously added me to the docket to do some Q&A. What questions do you have? Also, keep in mind that if I call you or whatever, you raise your hand or whatever, Bear's going to run around and give you a mic so that the people that are going to watch the recording later can also hear you. So, who has questions? Nobody, no questions. Nathan.
What do you think about Bower?
So I can tell you what we're doing about Bower. I think that the Bower team is doing an admirable job with what they have, and we are dropping Bower as quickly as we can. So ultimately, both Bower and NPM have problems, and they're not the greatest, neither one of them. But having both of them makes us have double the pain. So we're gonna be migrating directly to all NPM dependencies and add-ons and whatnot. I've been working on that project. I know other people have as well. But we have, I think, in the early 1.13 Ember CLI era, we had about 10 Bower dependencies. Now we have 5. So I'm continuing to lower that number, and then eventually we'll have none. One of the biggest ones is Ember itself and Ember data until recently. So Ember is going to be sort of a big pain because we have to essentially completely add-onize it and have the build pipeline actually work properly in apps instead of just sort of in a controlled environment that we have. But yeah, so that's hopefully going to be before we're final on the 2.x series. As probably some of you know, the Ember CLI 2.x series is still in beta, and that's mostly blocked on this add-onization effort. We can't really go stable until that is done because it's potentially a breaking change for some edge case things and whatnot.
What I can do with Ember data, man?
Ember data, what about Ember data?
Performance issues.
I mean, performance issues with regard to what?
If you have more than 1,000 records and you need to show it in one time, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, well, we have a couple of projects, specifically Ember Collection, to help you page in and out different sets of data. We are also working on APIs in Ember data to remove things from the internal cache if the cache itself gets too large. I know the Ember data team itself is working on RFCs and proposals to deal with that stuff. So, but I don't have any specifics.
And what about if we remove objects and make it more?
Remove objects?
Yeah, from Ember data and make it more Redux style.
Why not? Remove objects.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Because all problems with Ember model create, all performance problems you have with Ember model create when you create each instance.
No, that's actually not true.
It's true.
It is not. No.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Pods 2.0?
Yes. So I did a presentation at in Austin at Ember ATX. It's been a few months now. That is online. I talked about sort of the iterations, the things we've done so far to date, like the various versions of pods and iterations. I made up random version numbers basically in that presentation that didn't actually correspond to anything in reality. So that was great. That was really fun. And I said like the next version will be like roughly a 2.0 concept. In that presentation I presented a very specific structure, and as we sort of exposed that and circulated that around community, and it became very apparent that that was basically bananas. It was like just bonkers. So we're sort of rethinking some of the specifics and coming up with a more concrete proposal. We plan to have an RFC here in the next little while. I will not give dates, and hopefully that RFC will get some good feedback and we can move forward. The current, like the proposal that I talked about in that talk basically like included the type name at like every level. So you would end up with like, if you had a route that you would reference to with a transition to as like, you know, posts.post.edit or something, you would have app, post, app, routes, posts, routes, edit, routes, edit, and then your template, which is sort of hard to swallow. So I'm glad we got that pushback and that feedback, and now we're sort of reworking that a little bit. In the end, I think it'll be closer to what we have as pods today than what I talked about in that talk. But the final structure is still like TBD and whatnot. We're still working on it. We reviewed a whole bunch of proposals at the face-to-face that we just had this past weekend, last weekend, I guess. And then we're trying to sort of list the requirements and constraints to figure out what's sort of the best option go forward. Most likely, at least a couple of those options will be discussed in the RFC when we actually do the proposal to get feedback. I personally would like to see it happen in the 2.4 cycle or soon, basically, within the next 6 weeks or so. But there's no guarantee. That's just what I would like to see happen. All of the work in Ember itself is done to add support for local lookups, which is a very awesome feature, I think. And we are only waiting to enable it until we have like a more concrete pod structure, which is actually outside of Ember itself. It's like more resolver. It's more related to the Ember CLI app side. Okay. Oh, sorry.
So Angular 2 is out. It's in the beta, and including a lot of other frameworks with resources, they are moving so quickly. What's the plan for Ember to compete with these guys with less resources?
Yeah, so first of all, a really great blog post by Tom Dale a couple days ago, 2 days ago, which is the result of our discussions at the face-to-face, talking a lot about direction and sort of what's coming, what we're working on, and sort of next steps. The biggest thing for us right now that we're focusing on is the next iteration of the rendering engine, which will hopefully continue down the performance improvement path that we started on, and implement even better APIs and fix some of the weird hook APIs that we have, but also fast boot those things, and trying to figure out a better story for actions than what we have today, basically. So there's a whole slew. You should take a look at that blog post. We really, he spent a bunch of time putting that together and trying to line out like all the things that we talked about and what we're planning on doing.
Okay. What does the timeline look like for routable components, and what's taken so long?
So the short answer is they will be shipped when they are done. The long answer that's obviously pretty snarky, but the long answer is that they're blocked on a couple of things. First of all, we can't ship routable components with two-way binding. That seems kind of not good, right? So we are planning this angle bracket component, glimmer component, whatever you want to call them, scenario. And unfortunately, because we don't want to introduce new APIs that are stuck with legacy semantics, we can't really introduce the new APIs until that's done. Right, so that's part of the blocker, right? The other part of the blocker is how exactly, like today, in today's world, with classic structure, like the current like app/templates/components or something, your routable components names will actually be ambiguous. So you currently, like if we were to say, okay, let's do it right now, it's not. There's no way for us to do in a Semver compatible way without introducing a new type. And that's because you could have a component today that was post.new.edit or something like that, or whatever, some name that made sense. And your routable component can introduce the same thing, and now they conflict. Which one do we use? What are we doing, right? So there's a lot of constraints like that. What we plan to do is we plan to introduce a new type and tie that new type with the pods work that we're doing so that it'll be very ergonomic and very nice and convenient, but it also will be non-ambiguous so that we don't have to worry about backwards incompatible changes because that's pretty important to us. So the two gating factors are pods, which I just talked about, and also the angle bracket component implementation, which is basically the Glimmer v2 work that we're actively working on integration efforts. Did that answer okay? All right, cool.
I was wondering, what's the time frame for engines and for the router service?
So engines shipped in an add-on maybe 2 weeks ago. Ember-engines add-on. It is still experimental. It's like 0.1. Dan Gebhardt and I have been working on it for the last I want to say 2 or 3 months. And so there's like an experimental version you can play with. It does not include lazy loading. It does not include a few other things. There's a README. Dan gave a great talk at Boston Ember that you can take a look at. But the idea is that you can start implementing the API and see what it feels like. We want to learn from it. We implemented pretty faithfully the RFC that's currently proposed, like the current RFC, in an add-on so we can iterate. We hope to get feedback and users and actually like actual usage, and we're starting to get issues and people talking about, hey, what about this scenario or that scenario that's not really discussed in RFC, which is great. That's exactly what we want. As those things settle out, we're going to move the crazy monkey patches that we did upstream into Ember so we don't have to monkey patch weird things. And all that. But in the meantime, you can absolutely use it. You can use the engine syntax. Basically, an engine is like an add-on that has its add-on directory is in a separate container, resolver namespace, and all that stuff. So it's actually pretty neat. And they're isolated in concept. So if you tried to invoke a component in the engine that wasn't in the engine but it was in the app, it doesn't work. It's things like that. So that's all done. What was the second part of the question? Yeah, so router service is a giant thorn in my side. I think ultimately we should just ship something, but the RFC is basically not done. That's the problem. So there's been a lot of feedback in the RFC as written, and it's not fully baked yet. So we need to finish that. Unfortunately, Ed originally proposed it and did a lot of the initial work and expecting out the concepts and the issues. But we haven't really, we need someone else to like sort of pick up and like revamp and rework based on the current sort of line of thinking. I personally would like to see us ship a router service that adds some things that like you cannot do without controllers today. Things like current path, current route name, things like that, where you like in today's Ember, you have to use application controller to get that information. I hate that. So I want that to go away. The more complicated APIs are things like Transition 2, which are implemented in the private version of the routing service, but they're implemented in a way that's different than how you would use it from a route. So it's actually really unintuitive, right? So the current private service uses like an array for the args instead of the actual like sort of splatted out args. And it's quite different. And then we also have to figure out like what does it return? Does it return a promise? Does it like those things are still up in the air, and we have to sort of flesh that out. I think the biggest blocker is just someone to have time to consolidate the comments and the feedback that the community has given, the core team has given, and just like update that RFC, and then we can figure out like a sort of minimal a straightforward solution that is probably not what everyone wants, but we can ship and get it enabled, and then begin to iterate and add APIs. That's what I think should happen.
In Tom's blog post, he talked about you guys have been kind of holding off on deprecations. We're forcing over we have 3 left to get to 2.0. I'm guessing 2.5 is going to introduce some. Are we talking? You've been chomping at the bit. There's a fire hose, or there's.
So a couple of things. I've said this before, but 1.13 was basically a screw up in regards to deprecations. We shouldn't have done that, and I'm sorry. Secondly, there has been some deprecations. You may or may not have noticed them, but there have been some. I made sure that he updated his thing to not say no new deprecations have happened, because we introduced some new public APIs for things that were always private, things like the container. Previous to 2.3, there was no way to do like a lookup in a non-private way, and now you can, which is great. So we were careful to add deprecations if you did still call like this.container.something. So that was one deprecation. There's been a handful. There's not a giant list anywhere. There's no like big burn it down list like we had for 1.13 or 1.x. And our plan, or my plan personally, hell, I'd love if we never had a 3.0, but I don't think that's feasible. But my plan personally is to make sure that we sort of feather them out and make it so that it's just a more cohesive story as we go. And as we feather them out and like add deprecations, have things like the Ember get owner polyfill, which lets you use the new public API with older versions of Ember to allow you to upgrade easier. Or in the case of add-ons that need to do things across multiple Ember versions, make all that stuff easier. So that's what I hope that we continue to do. So far in the 2X series, we've been hopefully pretty good about it. And I think that should continue. We do not have a giant list of things to deprecate. There are a handful of things that we've talked about, but nothing that's like a major API that people are always using and stuff. We try to search like GitHub, do a GitHub search to figure out like what are if the thing is super common and we just don't know the use cases. And then the other side of that is that we're trying to make sure that deprecation guys have more than one scenario if there is more than one scenario to be done. So one of the issues that we had in 113 is we either didn't write a deprecation guide or we did and it was not complete. So like sortable mix-in, basically. It was deprecated and removed into an add-on, but we didn't really go over all of the possible ways you might use it and what you should replace it with. So those are the kinds of things that we're working on. I don't know if that answered the question at all, but.
Questions on this side of the room?
Actually, I have two questions for you. One, when are you breaking an Ember CLI compatibility with 1X, specifically 110?
110 of Ember?
Yeah, when is Ember CLI breaking compatibility with Ember 110? At what point does that occur? Has it already occurred?
So I will tell you a couple of things. The first one is that it's very important to me to continue to support Ember versions that are older than what the Ember CLI version is. Okay. The default new app generated thing will always be, or hopefully always be, the stable version of Ember. That makes sense. Like new users should start with a new thing.
Ember init, I have to go fix it.
Exactly, correct. So we historically, as of right now, Ember, the current beta of Ember CLI, which is like 2.3.0 beta 1, right? It supports Ember 1.0.0, right? Okay. So like, it would take a lot to get to 10. And I'm not saying we would never do it, but the amount of code that it takes to support the older versions in Ember CLI is fairly low. Okay. The biggest issue is regarding the various handlebars versions that you had to have at all those different times. Yeah. That's hard to manage as a human, right? In user space, but that's not Ember CLI's problem. We just use the version of handlebars that you had, right? Right. And good luck figuring it out. But yeah, so we, I don't think we currently plan to drop support for any specific Ember version at all. Okay. Now, that's not saying we will never do it.
Well, I figured with...
There's no plans or anything.
Okay, I just kind of assumed with all the new changes with like the pod structure and all that stuff that would somehow be incompatible with 1X and
so you will not be able to use certain features. For example, local lookup required changes in Ember. If you want to use local lookup, you need to be on newer versions of Ember, right? But there's nothing to say that your current 110 app that works fine today will stop working.
Well, right. What I'm wondering is if, as improvements to Ember CLI come up and add-on structure changes and so on, whether or not upgrading Ember CLI but not Ember will break us.
It's certainly possible, but it's pretty important that it not.
Right, and I haven't had that experience so far. I mean, I went from the first beta version of Ember CLI successfully to the latest. And worked perfectly fine. There was one version in there that didn't work, and it was just skipped it to, went from like 0.3 to 1.13. Sure. Worked perfectly fine. I just wanted to see if that was intentional. And it sounds like it was, which is awesome.
It is absolutely intentional to support older versions. Many of us on the core team and many contributors to Ember CLI are actively developing applications that are not on Ember 2.0. Yes,
and I think a lot of us are too.
Yep.
Second question, fast boot. Have you heard anything about it?
Well, the API that's required, for fastboot went public and is in the current stable version of Ember, Ember 2.3.0. You'll have to upgrade from 110 though. The Ember CLI fastboot add-on itself is not declared 1.0, but it is like, I don't know, whatever version. Look it up. Some version number, and we're fast trying to iterate towards releasing a 1.x of that add-on also. So the API, underlying API in Ember that we use is stable and is updated. I think there was one bug that was identified shortly after 2.3.0 was released, and it's in the release branch that had to do with tagless components. But in general, it's stable, it works, and we're actively pushing forward the rest of the story. There's a whole lot of work that we need to do to make things like add-ons test by default with fastboot, so you know that a given add-on, including in your project, doesn't kill your fastboot server, things like that. Those are all sort of like additive, and those are things that we're actively iterating towards. Tom has been doing a ton of work in Fastboot land on Fastboot server, on Ember CLI Fastboot, on things like deployment platforms, like an Ember CLI deploy plugin for Elastic Beanstalk, for example, for Fastboot. So all that stuff is like in the works and actively being pushed forward pretty quickly.
Hey, can you talk about adding custom test helpers to integration tests?
Yes, I can talk about mostly anything. So let me describe what we're currently doing before I answer the specific question, right? So I'm working with Martin and Matt on refactoring pretty drastically the way that acceptance and integration tests work, so that they actually use the same API instead of having completely different APIs, which is like really, really annoying, like massively annoying. We're also, in that same effort, working on moving towards using async await, which likely means transitioning to ESLint, because JSInt is JSInt. And so that's part of the answer. So when we do that transition, most likely things like for example, it's really, really annoying in a component integration test today that you can't do like click, like the familiar click helper, or have async automatically handled for you. You have to, at least there's APIs today, like within the last few months with the wait helper that we introduced, but it's still very, very annoying, right? You're doing like simulated jQuery clicks, which are like actually different than what users do. It's just really, really annoying. So we're working, we have a plan. There will be an RFC for the final API. I hope to have an RFC like draft written fairly sometime in February. And we're working on like prototyping and spiking out the actual implementation in the like Ember test helpers library, and then ultimately up to Ember Qunit and Ember Mocha, so that we can use them. There's a lot of moving parts to the migration, to the proposal, not migration. We're not talking about migrations yet. There's a lot of moving parts to the proposal because of the async await stuff, but that also gives us a lot of power and a lot of control where today you have none. But specifically to talk about test helpers, today's story is actually pretty poor, or fairly poor, in regards to integration test helpers. You can write them, it's totally possible, it's just a function you import and call, but there's a whole bunch of gotchas that you have to know about, and it's quite annoying. In the sort of the RFC that I'm working on, and the new sort of structure where you might have this.click in both acceptance tests and in integration tests. Like basically all the things that make sense to be in both will be in both. Things like visit would not be in a component integration test because they're like they expect a full app boot. But most of the rest of the APIs will likely be, some version of them will be available in both tests, and they will feel like the same API. It'll be a much more consistent feel, look and feel, and hopefully the only difference really is whether you call visit or not, because it's routing or not routing, and then whether you like maybe supply a template for like this.render. That probably still exists because that's very useful in component integration tests. But the rest of the stuff, the way like the programming paradigm for tests should be the same between both. I think that's pretty important, and that's I think we've come a long way from Ember 1.x or 1.0.0 where like testing anything without an app was roughly impossible. Like very smart people could do it, I could not. And now it's possible, but we've got a whole lot of baggage that we accrued along the way, making it possible that we need to fix. So we're actively pushing that forward.
Speaking about testing and baggage, can you talk about Qunit versus Mocha?
Okay, you got to give me more than that.
It seems like so. Ember in general seems to support have bigger and deeper support for Qunit. Is Mocha support kind of coming up? And
so I personally support both frameworks. And every time so we made a separate, Dan Gebhardt did a lot of the initial work, and then we as sort of collectively have been maintaining the various frameworks. But we made a separate repo and that deals with the Ember specific parts. That's relatively it's actually completely test framework agnostic. And then that same underlying library is wrapped by Ember Qunit and wrapped by Ember Mocha. And so you could do Jasmine, or you could do like whatever, tape or something. Like you could do any of that, right? So I think that this, from a support perspective, I support both things. I personally use Ember Qunit. I just know it better. I like it better, but that's a personal preference. And I think from a sort of more fundamental Ember perspective, both, like any test framework should work, right? The idea in Ember is that the test framework, we have a test framework adapter, and you can implement your own adapter that helps Ember know how to deal with specific things, like how to enter async in the test, and like async start, async stop in the concepts of either Mocha or Qunit, but like all of them have different APIs. And then also what to deal with like exceptions or failures. But that's a very tiny API. It's like 3 methods. It's literally async start, stop, and exception. And so implementing that for any test framework should be trivial, and then figuring out how to wrap the underlying Ember test helpers library is also fairly straightforward. I'm actively working. I have an open issue on Ember Qunit to implement the recently added nested module structure for Qunit, which is one of the major selling points in my mind for Mocha. The ability to like nest the describe blocks is sometimes great, but more often than I see abused with like way too complicated nesting and setup, and like you can get some really hairy things that you don't understand what's happening. But I think that's probably true of roughly anything. So it's with great power and all that stuff, right? So hopefully we'll be adding the nested module syntax structure to Ember Qunit in the next little while. Most likely it'll be after we finish the at least proposed API for the new refactor, because I don't think it makes sense to introduce 2 completely new APIs at the same time that aren't complementary to each other, or that aren't related, I'm sorry. So I have no idea if I answered your question now. Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again, Twitch, for hosting, and we will see you guys in February.